The dirt at Vance Hollow Farm had gone the color of ash. Cracks split the topsoil into a mosaic of dead ground, and above it the sky sat low and gray, the kind of sky that promised rain and never delivered. Emery Vance knelt in the middle of that ruined field, a slab of engraved stone balanced across her knees. Her jeans were caked in dust. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from what she was holding. Behind her, a small crowd had gathered near the fence line. Word traveled fast in a town this size, and half of Merrill County had shown up to watch. Someone laughed, then another. A man in a feed store cap held up his phone, filming, narrating quietly to whoever was watching on the other end. A county official flipped through paperwork on a clipboard, glancing at his watch. Near the trucks, a buyer from a regional grain co-op shook his head slowly, the way people do when they've already decided something is finished. "She's talking to rocks now," someone muttered. Emery didn't move. She stared at the single green shoot pushing up through the cracked earth in front of her, impossibly alive in a field that had produced nothing for 2 seasons. It stood maybe 4 inches tall, its leaves a shade of green that didn't belong anywhere near this dust bowl. A polished black SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of the drive. A man in a tailored jacket stepped out, unbothered by the dirt clinging to his shoes. Dale Renner, regional director for Weathermark Agricultural Group, had the calm, patient face of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice even, "I understand this is difficult, but holding on to folklore isn't going to pay off that loan. Weathermark's offer is still on the table, and honestly, it's more generous than the land is worth right now." He said it kindly. That was what made it worse. The county official cleared his throat. "Emery, if we don't see a viable harvest plan by the deadline, the bank has the right to." He never finished the sentence. A cloud of dust rose from the county road as another vehicle approached, older, dented, moving fast. It skidded to a stop, and a woman climbed out before the engine had fully died, leaving the door open behind her. She wore a canvas field jacket and carried a satchel that looked like it had survived several decades of use. She was already walking toward Emery before anyone could ask who she was. She stopped at the edge of the field, saw the stone in Emery's hands, and went completely still. "Where," she said slowly, "did you find that?" It wasn't a question. It was closer to a demand. Renner's easy smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. The crowd went quiet. 3 months earlier, Vance Hollow Farm had been in Emery's family for 4 generations. Her great-great-grandfather cleared the first acres by hand. Her grandfather expanded the herd and the grain rotation until the farm fed half the county during the lean years. Her father took over after that, then passed the whole operation to Emery 8 months ago, not by plan, but by a heart attack in the equipment shed on a Tuesday morning. She was 26. She had a statistics degree she'd never used on the farm and a stubborn refusal to let 4 generations of work get auctioned off because nobody thought a young woman could run 300 acres alone. The farm wasn't just land to her. It held her father's handwriting in the margins of old ledgers, her grandmother's canning jars still lined up in the cellar, and a set of promises nobody had ever said out loud, but everyone understood anyway. You don't sell what your people built. You find a way. Finding a way was getting harder every month. The topsoil had thinned after years of drought and poor rotation decisions made before Emery ever had a say in things. Grain bins that used to fill by August now sat half empty by October. The tractor needed parts she couldn't afford. Stacks of unpaid invoices lived in a drawer she'd stopped opening. Her grandmother, Ruth, still lived in the farmhouse's back room, 81 years old and sharper than most people gave her credit for. She spent her mornings on the porch, shelling beans or mending fence wire, telling stories nobody asked to hear anymore. People in town treated her like background noise. Emery had learned, slowly, that Ruth noticed things other people missed entirely. Your great-great-grandfather used to talk about the old stone wall out past the north pasture, Ruth said one evening, watching Emery scrub dirt from under her fingernails at the kitchen sink. Said his own grandfather told him never to dig it up. Bad luck, he called it. Bad luck, Emery repeated, only half listening. That's what they said. I always thought it was something else. People call things bad luck when they don't understand them. Emery's best friend, Dana Whitfield, ran the diner in town and had known Emery since they were 7 years old, back when they used to race bikes down the gravel road that split their two family farms. Dana was the kind of friend who showed up with a thermos of coffee and blunt honesty in equal measure. You look like hell, Dana told her one morning, sliding into the seat across from Emery at the counter. When's the last time you slept more than 4 hours? When's the last time the bank stopped calling? Dana didn't have an answer for that. Around town, opinion on Emery split down predictable lines. Older farmers who remembered her father respected her grit, even if they doubted she could pull it off alone. Younger ones, especially those managing larger operations backed by Weathermark contracts, treated her like a cautionary tale in progress. At the feed store, at church, at the gas station, she felt the same quiet judgment everywhere she went. How long before she gives up? There were smaller humiliations, too, the kind nobody wrote headlines about. A supplier who'd once extended her father 30 days, credit without a second thought, now wanted payment up front. A neighbor who used to lend equipment freely suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever Emery needed to borrow a combine. None of it was cruel, exactly. It was simply the slow, unspoken way a community tells someone it doesn't expect her to last. She fed the cattle before sunrise. She mended fence in the afternoon heat. She sat at the kitchen table most nights running numbers that refused to add up, no matter how many times she reordered them. Every dollar got stretched until it tore. Every plan hinged on a harvest the soil couldn't currently produce. She wasn't just trying to save a business. She was trying to keep a promise she'd never technically made but felt bound to anyway. The wall came up in conversation again in early spring, when a section of old fencing along the north pasture finally gave out, and Emery went to repair it herself rather than pay a crew she couldn't afford. The stone wall Ruth had mentioned ran along the property's old boundary, mostly buried under decades of overgrowth. While clearing brush to reach a broken post, Emery's shovel struck something that wasn't rock. It took her 20 minutes of careful digging to free it, a flat slab of stone, roughly the size of a serving tray, covered edge to edge in symbols she didn't recognize. Not letters. Not anything she'd seen in a textbook. Beside it, wrapped in what remained of decayed cloth, sat a sealed clay vessel, and inside that, a handful of dried seeds, unlike anything in her father's seed catalogs. She carried all of it back to the house and spread it across the kitchen table like evidence, in a case she didn't understand yet. Ruth went quiet when she saw it. Genuinely quiet, which for Ruth was rare. That's it, she said finally. That's what he wouldn't dig up. Grandma, what is this? Ruth shook her head slowly. I don't know the whole of it. Only that your great-great-grandfather, said his own grandfather, brought seed with him when the family first settled here, and that seed came from somewhere older than any of us. Said it was meant to survive things regular crops couldn't. Emery ran her thumb across one of the carved symbols. It felt deliberate, patterned, not decorative scratching. That night, she found a box of her father's old papers in the attic, unopened since his death. Buried among receipts and equipment manuals was a slim leather journal that had belonged to her great-great-grandfather. Most of it detailed ordinary farm life, weather, livestock, crop yields. but scattered through the later pages were references to the old harvest, always mentioned briefly, almost cautiously, as though the writer wasn't sure he should be writing it down at all. One line stopped her cold, buried it back where I found it. Some things aren't meant for easy ground. She didn't sleep that night. Emery brought a photograph of the symbols to Marion Castellanos, a local historian who taught part-time at the community college and had a reputation for taking obscure things seriously. Marion studied the image for a long time without saying anything. These resemble agricultural marking systems used by several ancient farming cultures, she said eventually. I'm not an expert in this specific script, but the pattern isn't random. It looks instructional. Instructional how? I'd want to see the original before I guess. When Marion finally examined the stone itself weeks later, she brought in a colleague from a university archaeology department for a second opinion. Neither would commit to a firm conclusion, but both agreed on one thing: the carving style and the vessel's construction suggested an age far older than anything typically found in this region. Preliminary dating estimates, when they came back, suggested the vessel and its contents could be roughly 3,000 years old. Emery read the number twice before it landed. Meanwhile, she'd started testing the seeds in a small experimental corner of the north pasture, half out of curiosity and half out of desperation. She had nothing left to lose by trying something strange in a field that already wasn't producing. Word of the stone spread before Emery was ready for it. The neighbors laughed first. At the feed store, she overheard someone joking that the Vance girl had started planting rocks instead of corn. A photo of her kneeling by the experimental plot found its way onto social media, and the comments underneath ranged from mocking to outright cruel. Someone edited the photo with a caption calling her the county's newest tourist attraction. What if they're right? She asked Dana one night, staring at her phone. What if I'm just embarrassing myself in front of everyone who already thinks I can't do this? Dana took the phone out of her hand and set it face down on the counter. You dug up something real. Whatever it means, it's real. Let people laugh. They'll still be talking when you prove them wrong. The bank wasn't laughing. A letter arrived shortening her repayment window. Citing missed projections from the previous season, the new deadline gave her roughly 10 weeks to show meaningful progress or risk losing the farm outright. Not long after, Weathermark made its first move. Dale Renner showed up in person, offering to buy the north pasture parcel, specifically the section containing the old stone wall, for a price well above market value. He framed it as generosity. Emery framed it as suspicious. Nobody paid triple market rate for land they hadn't even inspected unless they already knew something worth paying for. She declined. 2 weeks later, county agricultural inspectors arrived unannounced, questioning her unconventional planting methods and requesting documentation she didn't have time to produce on short notice. The inspection delayed her work by nearly a week and cost her money she didn't have to spare on unnecessary permits. Then the weather turned against her. A late-season storm rolled through with high winds and no rain, the kind that stripped moisture from soil that was already starving for it. She spent 2 sleepless nights covering the experimental plot with whatever tarps and windbreaks she could scrounge from the barn, watching the sky the way sailors watch storms they can't outrun. The photo of the engraved stone kept circulating online. A regional news blog picked it up with a mocking headline about modern-day treasure. Hunters, strangers she'd never met left comments, speculating about her mental state. By the time the storm passed, Emery was running on fumes, financially and physically. Every obstacle had arrived in a different shape, and everyone had cost her something she couldn't easily get back. Before we go further, if you're new here, this is the kind of story we like to tell. Real land, real families, and the quiet, stubborn history buried underneath both. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Now, back to the North Pasture. Against every reasonable expectation, the experimental plot survived. While neighboring fields wilted under the storm's aftermath, the small patch of ancient seed stood green and upright, untouched by conditions that had damaged crops for miles around. Emery walked the rows at dawn, half convinced she was imagining it, running her hands over stalks that shouldn't have made it through the week, let alone thrived. It wasn't a full harvest. It was one small, stubborn section of a much larger problem, but it was undeniable, and undeniable things have a way of attracting attention. A researcher from the State Agricultural University reached out after seeing the storm survival mentioned online, requesting soil and plant samples for analysis. A local journalist, tired of mocking headlines, asked for an honest interview instead. For the first time in months, people were asking questions instead of making jokes. Then, 3 days before the university team was scheduled to collect samples, Emery went out to the plot at dawn and found the storage container holding the remaining preserved seeds gone. The lock on the equipment shed had been forced. Whoever took them had known exactly what they were looking for. The theft changed everything. Without physical evidence beyond what was already growing in the ground, Emery had no way to independently verify the seeds' origin or age beyond Marion's early assessments. The missing vessel and remaining stock represented most of the proof connecting the stone, the journal, and the crop. Sheriff's deputies filed a report, but rural break-ins rarely produced fast answers, and everyone involved knew it. The deputy on scene noted the shed lock had been forced with tools, not brute force, the kind of entry that suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what they were after. Suspicion settled quickly on Weathermark, though nothing close to proof existed yet. Renner denied any knowledge when Emery confronted him outside the co-op, his calm expression unmoving. "I have no interest in stolen property," he said. "I have interest in a fair land purchase, which you keep declining." Legal questions multiplied fast. A county antiquities office got involved once rumors of an ancient artifact reached local government, raising uncomfortable questions about who, technically, owned something found on private land but potentially significant to historical research. Whispers of patent interest began circulating. The idea that whoever controlled the genetic material might control something worth far more than the farm itself. An insurance adjuster wanted documentation Emery didn't have for a loss she hadn't planned around. And underneath all of it, the clock kept moving. The harvest inspection required to satisfy her agricultural loan terms was 14 days out. The bank's shortened deadline set 10 days away. Rumors of an auction date, should she fail to meet either requirement, put the worst-case outcome only a week beyond that. Emery barely slept during those days. She split her time between salvaging what remained of the experimental plot, fielding calls from lawyers she couldn't afford to retain, and trying to piece together who could have taken the seeds and why. Marion, it turned out, hadn't stopped investigating quietly on her own. She'd spent weeks cross-referencing the stone's symbols against archived agricultural records, eventually connecting with a retired archivist who recognized the marking style from an obscure academic paper decades old, one describing a long-overlooked settlement site associated with unusually resilient grain cultivation. Old shipping manifests from the County Historical Society, dug up during a separate unrelated project years earlier, listed a parcel of preserved seed stock, transported to the region generations back, matching almost exactly the timeline in Emery's family journal. A newspaper clipping from a regional archive, faded and easy to overlook, briefly mentioned a local farming family refusing to part with heirloom grain of unknown origin during a period of agricultural standardization decades earlier. Piece by piece, a picture formed. The farm sat, almost by accident of geography, near the edge of a site historians had once dismissed as agriculturally insignificant. New soil analysis suggested otherwise. Elevated mineral retention, unusual microbial diversity, patterns consistent with long-term intentional cultivation rather than natural growth. The seeds weren't just old. They carried genetic traits modern commercial grain had lost somewhere along the way, characteristics tied to drought resistance and soil regeneration that agricultural science had spent decades trying to reintroduce artificially. That was what Weathermark had suspected from the start. Not folklore, not a curiosity, a resource. The inspection day arrived, and with it, nearly everyone who'd stood at the edge of that field months earlier returned. County officials with their paperwork. The grain co-op buyer, unconvinced. Neighbors, some sympathetic now, some still waiting to see her fail. And Dale Renner, composed as ever, standing near his SUV. Emery knelt in the dirt one more time, the recovered stone tablet in her hands, courtesy of Marion's contact at the university, who had insisted on documenting it fully before any further disputes over ownership could complicate things. The single healthy seedling from the replanted stock stood beside her, small and green against the cracked earth. It was the same scene from months earlier, except now every person present understood what they were looking at. Marion arrived moments later, breathless, carrying a folder of findings she'd assembled just in time. She held up the stone, confirmed its authenticity to the inspectors, and laid out, plainly and without exaggeration, what the soil analysis and genetic testing had revealed. The traits preserved in that ancient grain weren't sentimental. They were, according to the university researchers' preliminary report, some of the most agriculturally significant findings the region had produced in decades. Renner's expression finally cracked. Documents obtained separately by the journalist covering the story, through public records requests filed weeks earlier, showed Weathermark had commissioned a private soil survey of the Vance property months before. Emery ever repaired that fence line well before any public knowledge of the stone existed. They'd suspected something valuable was there long before she found it. The land offer and the later break-in that conveniently coincided with a locked equipment shed, and a suspiciously well-informed thief no longer looked like coincidence to anyone standing in that field. Emery's instincts, dismissed for months as delusion, had been right from the very beginning. Vindication didn't pay off alone by itself, but it changed the terms of every conversation that followed. Within days, offers arrived that would have seemed impossible a season earlier. A biotech firm proposed an exclusive licensing deal worth more money than the farm had earned in a decade. Weathermark, stripped of its earlier leverage and facing its own uncomfortable questions, quietly withdrew from the situation altogether. Universities wanted research partnerships. Journalists wanted exclusives. Emery sat with Ruth and Dana at the kitchen table one evening, the same table where she'd first spread out the stone and the seeds, staring at contract offers that could solve every financial problem she had in a single signature. "You could sell it outright," Dana said carefully. "Nobody would blame you." Ruth said nothing at first, just turned her coffee mug slowly in her hands. "Your great-great-grandfather buried that seed because he didn't trust what people would do with it. Maybe it's time somebody trusted people to do right by it instead." Emery thought about the neighbors who'd laughed and the ones who hadn't. She thought about her father's handwriting in old ledgers, and about a farm meant to be lived on, not licensed away to the highest bidder. She chose the harder path. Instead of an exclusive sale, she partnered with the university's agricultural program to establish an open access seed preservation initiative one that would make the resilient genetic traits available to struggling farmers across the region, rather than locked behind a single corporate patent. The arrangement still generated enough licensing revenue to save Vance Hollow Farm several times over. It simply refused to let anyone else own it outright. The farm survived. The debt cleared within the year. Neighbors who'd once mocked her openly began stopping by to ask about the new soil program, some sheepish, some pretending they'd believed in her all along. Marion's research made its way into an academic publication that credited Emery and her family by name. Dane still brought coffee most mornings, though the conversations turned less desperate and more hopeful with each passing month. Neighboring farms, watching Vance Hollow's soil slowly recover using techniques drawn from the ancient cultivation patterns, began adopting similar restoration practices of their own. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, practical change, spreading field by field the way real change usually does. On a quiet morning the following spring, Emery walked out to the north pasture alone. No crowd, no cameras, just the early light settling over rows of healthy green stalks where cracked, lifeless dirt used to be. The original stone tablet sat now in a small, protective case near the farmhouse porch, a fixture rather than a spectacle. A neighbor's daughter, visiting with her mother that morning, wandered off toward the edge of the field and called out that she'd found something. Emery walked over. A fresh seedling had pushed up through the soil a few feet from the main planting, small, green, and stubborn, the way the very first one had been. She knelt down beside it the same way she had months earlier, except this time there was no laughter behind her, no officials with clipboards, no countdown pressing against her chest. Just quiet ground and something new growing out of something very old.